What happens when the person sworn to protect a kingdom is a woman in a world run by men? How does a mother lead a charge after her children have been harmed by the very enemy she must face? Why would someone choose the mud and blood of a battlefield over the silks and velvets of a throne room? History gives us the answers. They are not always stories of victory, but they are always stories of resolve. Number 17, how do you turn personal humiliation into a national uprising? Her husband tried to appease Rome. He wrote a will leaving half his kingdom to the Emperor Nero. This was meant to protect his family. It failed. After King Prasutagus of the Iceni died around 60 AD, Roman officials arrived. They did not honor his will. They seized his lands, they took the property of the Iceni nobles. When his widow, Queen Boudica, protested, they had her publicly flogged. Her 2 daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers. This was not just an injustice, it was a calculated act of humiliation. The Romans wanted to show that a native queen meant nothing. They made a mistake. Boudica faced an impossible situation. The Roman army in Britain was a professional killing machine. The X-14 Gemina and XX Valeria Victrix legions were some of the best troops in the empire. Boudica had no standing army. She had farmers and tribesmen armed with spears and long swords. They were brave, but they were not a disciplined force. The Romans had superior armor, better weapons, and a command structure honed over centuries. A direct confrontation was suicide. Her strategy was born from her own pain. She did not make this a war about territory or taxes. She made it about the deep personal violation her family and her people had suffered. She stood before the tribes, not just as a queen, but as a wronged woman and a mother. Ancient writers say she was tall, with long red hair and a harsh voice. She used this presence. She showed them her own flogged back. She spoke of her daughters. This turned a political problem into a visceral need for revenge. She united the Iceni, the Trinovantes, and other tribes through shared rage. This was the first part of her strategy: transform a political grievance into a human crusade. The second part was to avoid the Roman army's strength. The main Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away campaigning in Wales on the island of Mona. He had taken the best legions with him. Boudica knew this. Her strategy was to strike the symbols of Roman power while they were undefended. This was not a plan of conquest. It was a plan of extermination. Her first target was Camulodunum, modern Colchester. It was a colony for retired Roman soldiers. It was the center of the imperial cult, with a huge temple dedicated to the former Emperor Claudius. To the Britons, this place was the heart of their oppression. Boudica's army fell upon it. The city had no walls. The retired soldiers were complacent. They were overwhelmed. The Britons showed no mercy. They burned the city to the ground. The archaeologists today can still see the thick red and black layer of ash from that fire. The news sent a shockwave through Roman Britain. The 9 Hispana Legion marched to relieve the city. Boudica's forces ambushed them. They annihilated the legion's infantry. Only the commander and some cavalry escaped. This victory was huge. A Roman legion had been broken by a tribal army. It proved to her followers that the Romans were not invincible. It drew even more people to her cause. Her army swelled, perhaps, to over 100,000 people. Next, she marched on Londinium, modern London. It was a new, thriving commercial hub. It was full of Roman citizens, merchants, and officials. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, raced back from Wales. He reached Londinium before Boudica, but he looked at his small force and the city's lack of fortifications. He made a brutal calculation. He could not defend it. He abandoned Londinium to its fate. Boudica's army descended and repeated what they did in Camulodunum. The city was burned. Anyone who did not flee was killed. Her third target was Verulamium near St. Albans. It was a city of pro-Roman Britons. To Boudica, these people were traitors. Her army destroyed it as well. In a short span, she had wiped out the 3 main centers of Roman life in southern Britain. Her strategy was working. She had used speed, terror, and the Roman army's absence to cripple the province. The final battle came. And Suetonius had gathered his forces, about 10,000 men from the 14 and XX legions, plus auxiliaries. He was massively outnumbered, but he chose the battlefield. He found a narrow gorge with a forest behind him. This meant Boudica's army could not use its numbers to surround him. Had to attack him head-on in a tight space where Roman discipline and short swords would be most effective. Boudica's Britons brought their families to watch, parking their wagons in a crescent behind their army. They expected a great victory. This was a fatal mistake. The open-field Celtic charge was no match for the constricted professional Roman line. The Romans held, threw their javelins, and then advanced in a tight wedge. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Britons tried to flee, but their own wagons blocked their escape. The Romans killed soldiers and civilians alike. It was a total defeat for Boudica. She escaped the battlefield but died soon after, either from illness or by taking poison. Her rebellion was over. But was her strategy a failure? She lost the war. Yet her uprising was so violent and so successful in its early stages that Emperor Nero seriously considered pulling all Roman forces out of Britain. The rebellion forced the Roman administration to change. They began to treat the British tribes with more caution and a little more respect. Boudica's strategy of turning personal pain into a unifying force and striking at undefended civilian centers was brilliant in its conception and terrifying in its execution. She failed in the final tactical battle, but her strategic vision nearly drove the world's greatest empire off her island. Number 16. When your enemy expects a navy, should you give them one? Artemisia I ruled Caria, a small kingdom in modern Turkey, in the 5th century BC. She was a subject of the great Persian king, Xerxes. When Xerxes decided to invade Greece in 480 BC, he assembled a massive army and navy from all corners of his empire. Artemisia was obligated to contribute. She did more than that. She arrived with 5 ships, which were said to be the best in the entire fleet, second only to the ships from Sidon. She did not send a man to command them. She commanded them herself. This was highly unusual. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that all of Xerxes' advisors were amazed a woman would join the expedition. The Persian invasion went well at first. The army pushed south, but the key was the sea. The Greek navy, though outnumbered, was skilled in fighting in home waters. The decisive naval battle was to be at Salamis. The Persian fleet was huge, maybe over 800 ships. The Greeks had fewer than 400. On the eve of the battle, Xerxes held a council of war. All his commanders and subject kings were there. He asked if they should risk a naval battle in the narrow straits of Salamis. Everyone, eager to please the king, said yes. Attack. Use your superior numbers. Crush the Greeks. Everyone except Artemisia. She stood up, the only woman in a room of powerful men. And she advised against it. Her strategy was one of patience and logistics. She told Xerxes his fleet was superior, but the Greeks were better sailors, man for man. In the narrow straits, the huge Persian fleet would get bunched up. They would run into each other. Their numbers would become a disadvantage. She proposed a different plan. Do not fight at sea. Instead, use the army. Either march on the Peloponnese, the heartland of the Spartan resistance, or simply wait. The Greek fleet was a coalition of different city-states. They were short on supplies. They were already arguing amongst themselves. If the Persian army threatened their homes, she argued their fleet would break up. The Athenians would be left alone. Then the Persians could pick them off. It was a brilliant strategy. It targeted the enemy's weakest point, their fragile alliance, and their supply chain. It avoided a risky battle where the Greeks had the advantage of terrain. Xerxes heard her advice. He was impressed by her intelligence and her courage to speak against all his other commanders. He praised her, and then he ignored her. He listened to the majority and ordered the attack. The Battle of Salamis unfolded exactly as Artemisia had predicted. The large Persian ships crowded into the narrow straits. They were clumsy and slow. The smaller, more agile Greek triremes rode circles around them. The Persian fleet became a confused mess. Ships crashed into each other. They could not maneuver. The Greeks rammed and sank them one by one. In the middle of this chaos, Artemisia found herself in a desperate situation. Her ship was being pursued by an Athenian vessel. She was trapped. In front of her was one of her own allies, a Persian ship. Her escape was blocked. Here, She made a split-second tactical decision that was both ruthless and brilliant. She ordered her helmsman to turn and ram the friendly Persian ship. The Athenian ship pursuing her saw this. The captain assumed her ship must be Greek, or perhaps a Persian ship that had defected. Why else would it be sinking another Persian vessel? The Athenian captain turned away to chase other targets. Artemisia had created a perfect deception. She saved herself. There was an extra benefit. The ship she sank was commanded by a Khalendian king with whom she had a feud. She solved two problems at once. King Xerxes was watching the battle from a throne set up on a hillside overlooking the bay. He saw Artemisia's ship sink another. His advisors, not realizing she had sunk one of their own, told him, "Master, see how well Artemisia is fighting. She has sunk an enemy ship." Xerxes, watching the rest of his fleet get destroyed, reportedly said, "My men have become women, and my women men." After the devastating defeat at Salamis, Xerxes had to decide what to do next. He had lost a huge part of his navy. He called another council. This time, he specifically asked for Artemisia. He sent everyone else away so he could speak to her alone. He trusted her judgment now. He asked if he should lead another attack himself or withdraw to Persia and leave his general, Mardonius, in charge. Again, she gave him blunt, smart advice. She told him to go home. She said he had already achieved his main goal. He had burned Athens. He could declare victory and return to his palace. If he left Mardonius behind, any success would still be the king's success. But if Mardonius failed, the blame would be on the general, not on Xerxes. This would protect the king's reputation. It was politically astute. It allowed him to save face while cutting his losses. This time, Xerxes listened. He took her advice completely. He retreated to Persia, leaving a smaller army with Mardonius, which was defeated by the Greeks the following year at Plataea. Artemisia had not won the war for Persia, but her strategic thinking was flawless. Her first strategy, to avoid the Battle of Salamis and win by logistics, would likely have worked. Her second strategy, the tactical decision to ram an ally to escape, was a cold-blooded act of self-preservation that showcased her quick thinking under fire. And her third strategy, the political advice she gave Xerxes after the defeat, saved him from further humiliation. She was a master of seeing the whole board, from the movement of fleets to the egos of kings. Number 15, how do you avenge a murder with a flock of pigeons? In the 10th century, the land of the Rus was a loose federation of Slavic and Norse tribes centered around Kyiv. Its ruler in the 940s was Igor of Kyiv. He was not a sophisticated ruler. His main job was to travel around his lands and collect tribute from the various tribes. In 945, he went to collect tribute from a tribe called the Drevlians. He collected the agreed amount. And then, on his way home, he got greedy. He decided to go back and demand more. The Drevlians were furious. A medieval chronicle says they declared, "If a wolf comes to the sheep, he will take away the whole flock one by one, unless he is killed." They captured Igor and killed him in a brutal manner. This left his wife Olga as regent for their 3-year-old son, Sviatoslav. The Drevlians saw an opportunity. They had killed the Grand Prince. Now they could control the entire kingdom. Their prince, a man named Mal, sent 20 of his best men to Kyiv. Their proposal was simple. They wanted Olga to marry Prince Mal. This would make the Drevlians the new ruling power. Olga was now a widow, a single mother, and the ruler of a fragile kingdom. The Drevlians assumed she was a weak woman they could easily intimidate. They were wrong. Olga met their ambassadors with a calm face. She told them she was honored by their proposal. But she wanted to show them proper respect. She told them to go back to their boats and wait. The next day, her people would carry them in their boats to her palace, a great honor. The Drevlian ambassadors, puffed up with pride, agreed. The next day, Olga's people carried the Drevlians in their boat through the city, but they did not take them to the palace. They took them to a deep trench that Olga had ordered dug the night before. They threw the men and the boat into the trench and buried them alive. As they were being buried, Olga supposedly leaned over and asked if they were enjoying the honor. This was the first part of her revenge. It was a strategy of deception. She used her enemies' arrogance against them. She then sent a message back to Prince Mal. She said she accepted his proposal, but she needed the Drevlians' most distinguished men to accompany her to their land, so her own people in Kyiv would let her go. The Drevlians, not knowing what had happened to their first delegation, were pleased. They sent a party of their best chieftains and nobles to Kyiv. When they arrived, Olga greeted them warmly. She told them to go to the bathhouse to clean themselves after their long journey. The Drevlian nobles, happy to relax, went inside. Once they were all in, Olga's men locked the doors and set the bathhouse on fire. They were all burned to death. This was the second part of her revenge. She was systematically eliminating the Drevlian leadership. She was not done. She sent another message to the Drevlians. I am now coming to you. Prepare great quantities of meat in the city where you killed my husband, so that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him. The Drevlians, though, they must have been wondering where their two delegations were, did as she asked. Olga arrived with a small group of soldiers. She went to Igor's tomb and wept. Then the funeral feast began. The Drevlians drank heavily. Olga's soldiers served them, but did not drink themselves. When the Drevlians were drunk and defenseless, Olga gave a signal. Her soldiers drew their weapons and killed a reported 5,000 of them. This was a massacre, but it still was not the end. The final part of her strategy was the most creative. She returned to Kyiv, gathered a larger army, and laid siege to the Drevlian capital, Iskorostan. The city held out for a year. They had survived the loss of their leaders and the massacre at the feast. They would not surrender. Olga saw the siege was at a stalemate, so she resorted to psychological and biological warfare. She sent a message to the people inside the city. She told them she was tired of revenge. She had killed their ambassadors and their nobles. That was enough. Now, she just wanted a small tribute to show they accepted her authority. She did not ask for gold or furs. She asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The people of Iskorostan were relieved. This was a tiny price to pay for peace. They quickly gathered the birds and sent them out to Olga. They thought the war was over. Olga took the birds. She waited until dusk. Then she told her soldiers to attach a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth to each bird's leg. They lit the sulfur and released the birds. The pigeons and sparrows all flew back to their homes, to their nests in the eaves and thatched roofs of the houses in Iskorostan. The entire city caught fire at once. The people fled the burning city in a panic. Olga had her soldiers waiting outside the walls. They captured the fleeing citizens. The siege was broken, not by force, but by a clever trick that turned the city's own ecosystem against it. And Olga's revenge was complete. Her strategy was a multi-stage masterpiece of deception, psychological manipulation, and unconventional warfare. She identified her enemy's weakness, their pride and underestimation of her, and exploited it at every turn. She eliminated their leadership, weakened their army, and finally destroyed their capital with a plan no one could have predicted. She secured her son's throne and solidified the power of Kyiv over the surrounding tribes. Her methods were brutal, but in the harsh world of the 10th century, her strategic brilliance ensured her survival and the survival of her kingdom. Number 14, Can a Queen Rule? 2 kingdoms from a prison cell. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful people of the 12th century. By birth, she was Duchess of Aquitaine, a huge and wealthy territory in France. By her first marriage, she was Queen of France. By her second marriage to Henry II, she was Queen of England. She was intelligent, educated, and politically savvy. She was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. She did not lead armies into a charge, but her entire life was a strategic campaign to wield power, and she conducted some of her most brilliant maneuvers while under arrest. In 1173, her relationship with her husband, King Henry II, had broken down. Henry was controlling. He kept her sons, his heirs, on a tight leash. He had a famous affair with a woman named Rosamund Clifford. Eleanor had had enough. She made a strategic decision to break Henry's power by turning his own sons against him. She encouraged her sons, Henry the young king, Richard the future Lionheart, and Geoffrey, to rebel against their father. This was the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174. Eleanor's strategy was to create a multi-front war. She used her influence in her native Aquitaine to raise troops there. She coordinated with her former husband, the King of France, who was always happy to cause trouble for the King of England. She planned to have her sons fighting in Normandy while she secured the south in Aquitaine. It was a grand strategic design. But it failed, as she was trying to travel from her lands in Poitou to join her sons in Paris. She was captured by Henry II's forces. She was dressed as a man at the time, trying to slip through enemy territory. Henry II imprisoned her. For the next 15 years, she was moved between various castles in England and France. She was held under house arrest. For most people, this would be the end of their political career. For Eleanor, it was just a new phase. Her strategy had to change. She could no longer direct rebellions, so she started to play a long game. A game of influence, patience, and information. Even in prison, she was still the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. And Henry could not completely strip her of her title and lands. The people of Aquitaine were fiercely loyal to her, not to their English king. From her captivity, Eleanor maintained a network of contacts. She received messengers, she wrote letters. She remained the center of a political web. She knew that Henry needed her. If he treated her too harshly, Aquitaine might erupt in a revolt he could not control. Her imprisonment itself became a strategic tool. It made Henry look like a tyrant to the nobles of Aquitaine and to the French court. Her main strategy was to build up the power and reputation of her favorite son, Richard. She had seen that her eldest son, Henry the young king, was charismatic but unreliable. Richard was the better warrior and leader. She used her influence to make sure Richard was seen as the true heir and the rightful ruler of Aquitaine. When her sons rebelled again against their father in later years, it was often with Eleanor's quiet encouragement from afar. She was a constant destabilizing presence in the background of Henry II's reign. In 1189, Henry II died. Richard the Lionheart became king. His very first act was to order his mother released. Eleanor, now in her late 60s, walked out of prison and immediately took control. Richard was a great soldier, but he was not interested in the day-to-day business of ruling England. He wanted to go on crusade. So Eleanor became his regent. Her strategy now was to govern and protect the kingdom he was leaving behind. She was brilliant at it. She made a royal progress through England, releasing people unjustly imprisoned by Henry II and demanding oaths of loyalty to Richard. She secured the treasury. She managed the difficult relationship with the church. She essentially ran the country. Her biggest test came when Richard was captured on his way back from the crusade and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a massive crisis. Richard's younger brother John saw his chance. He started plotting with the King of France to seize the throne. Eleanor was faced with a challenge on two fronts, raising an impossible sum of money for the ransom and simultaneously stopping a coup d'etat at home. Her strategy was a masterclass in political administration. To raise the ransom, which was a staggering 150,000 marks, she levied a 25% tax on income and property across England. It was a huge burden, but she managed the collection process with remarkable efficiency. She personally oversaw the counting of the treasure. At the same time, she dealt with John's rebellion. She rallied the loyal barons. She directed military operations against John's castles. She worked with the Archbishop of Canterbury to excommunicate John, using the power of the church as a political weapon. She managed to keep England stable, raise the ransom, and suppress the rebellion, all while her son, the king, was a prisoner thousands of miles away. She traveled to Germany herself, an old woman by medieval standards, to deliver the ransom and bring her son home. When Richard returned, John's power collapsed. Eleanor had saved his kingdom. Her strategies were not about battlefield tactics. They were about wielding soft power, maintaining networks, managing finances, and outmaneuvering political rivals. She proved that you could rule effectively from a prison cell, and that the skills of governance were just as critical as the skills of war. She played the long game for 15 years and won. Number 13, what if your best weapon is your enemy's greed? Tomyris was the queen of the Massachetae, a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived on the steppes of Central Asia in the 6th century BC. They were skilled horse archers and fierce warriors. Their land was in the path of the expanding Persian Empire, ruled by one of history's most famous conquerors, Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had already conquered the Medes, the Lydians, and the Babylonians. He seemed unstoppable. Now he turned his attention to the Massachetae. His first move was not military, it was political. He sent ambassadors to Queen Tomyris with a proposal of marriage. Tomyris saw this for what it was. It was not a romantic offer, it was a strategic move to absorb her kingdom without a fight. If she married Cyrus, she would become just another one of his subject queens, and the Massachetae would lose their independence. Her strategy was simple and direct. She refused, she told him to stay in his own kingdom and let her rule hers. Cyrus, his diplomatic approach rejected, decided on a military solution. He began building a bridge across the Araxes River, the border of Tomyris' territory, to move his vast army into her lands. And Tomyris sent him a message. It was a bold challenge. She told him to stop building the bridge. She gave him a choice. Either he could let her people cross into his territory to fight, or he could cross into hers. She suggested he cross into her land, saying they could fight more honorably there. Cyrus's advisors were split. Most wanted to wait for the Massachetae on the Persian side of the river. But one of his advisors, the exiled Lydian king Croesus, offered a different plan. He suggested Cyrus use deception. He told Cyrus that the Massachetae were not used to the luxuries of Persian life, especially strong wine. The plan was to cross the river, advance a short distance, and set up a camp. In the camp, they should leave their weakest soldiers and a huge feast, with plenty of unwatered wine. The main Persian army would then retreat back towards the river and hide. Cyrus liked this plan. He followed it exactly. And Tomyris, seeing the Persians advance and then retreat, sent a third of her army under the command of her son Spargapises to attack. The Massachetae riders swept into the Persian camp. They easily overwhelmed the small force left behind. They found the feast, and as Croesus had predicted, they gorged themselves on the food and drank the strong wine until they were all drunk and passed out. Once they were incapacitated, Cyrus's main army returned. They fell upon the sleeping Massachetae and captured or killed most of them. Tomyris' son, Spargapises, was taken prisoner. The strategy of using the enemy's inexperience with luxury as a weapon had worked perfectly. When Queen Tomyris learned what had happened, that her army and her son had not been defeated in a fair fight, but tricked with wine, she was filled with rage. She sent a final message to Cyrus. She called him a bloodthirsty monster. She told him to return her son and leave her land. She swore an oath by the sun, the lord of the Massachetae, that if he did not, she would give him his fill of blood. Cyrus ignored her threat. While in captivity, Spargapises, once he sobered up and realized his shame, asked to be unbound. As soon as he was free, he took his own life. The news of her son's death destroyed any chance of peace. Tomyris gathered all her remaining forces for a final, decisive battle. This time, there were no tricks. The two armies met on the open steppe. The historian Herodotus described it as the fiercest battle ever fought between non-Greek peoples. It started with a long-range archery duel. Both sides fired arrows until they ran out. Then they closed in for close-quarters combat with spears and daggers. The fighting was brutal and lasted for a long time. But the Massachetae, fighting on their home ground and fueled by a desire for revenge, were stronger. They slowly ground down the Persian forces. In the end, the Persian army was destroyed. Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of empires, was killed. And Tomyris' strategy had evolved. At first, it was simple defiance. Then it was a challenge for an honorable battle. After she was tricked, her strategy became one of total war, fueled by a personal vendetta. She had the body of Cyrus brought to her. She had a wineskin filled with human blood. She had his head forced into the skin and declared, "I warned you that I would give you your fill of blood, and so I shall." Tomyris' brilliance was in her adaptability. She understood Cyrus's political strategy and rejected it. She fell for his tactical trick, a painful lesson, but she learned from it. She realized that Against an enemy like Cyrus, there could be no half measures. Her final strategy was to leverage the raw fury of her people and her own personal grief into a force powerful enough to defeat one of the greatest armies of the ancient world. She met deception with overwhelming force and proved that even a great conqueror could be brought down if he underestimated the resolve of a queen defending her land and her family. Number 12. How do you fight a superpower for 40 years? Nzinga Mbande was the queen of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in 17th century Angola. From the year she was born, in 1583, her land was under attack. The Portuguese were pushing inland from the coast. They were not just colonizers, they were slavers. Their goal was to capture people and ship them across the Atlantic to work on plantations in Brazil. This was a war for survival, not just for territory. The Portuguese had guns, cannons, and a global empire behind them. Nzinga had warriors with bows, arrows, and axes. Her first major strategic move came in 1622, before she was queen. Her brother was the king, and he was losing the war badly. He sent Nzinga to Luanda to negotiate a peace treaty with the Portuguese governor. When she arrived for the meeting, she saw the governor, Correia de Souza, sitting in a large velvet chair. The only other seating provided for her was a floor mat. This was a deliberate power play, an insult designed to show her that she was a lesser being. Nzinga did not complain. She did not sit on the floor. She calmly signaled to one of a dozen servants. The woman came forward, knelt on her hands and knees, and became a human chair for Nzinga. Nzinga then sat on her back, at the same eye level as the governor, and began the negotiations. This single act set the tone. It showed she would not be intimidated. It demonstrated that her authority came from her people, not from the approval of the Portuguese. It was a brilliant piece of political theater. She successfully negotiated a treaty where the Portuguese recognized her brother's kingdom and agreed to withdraw their troops. The Portuguese, of course, did not honor the treaty. When her brother died in 1624, Nzinga became queen. The war with Portugal resumed immediately. She knew she could not defeat the Portuguese in a conventional war. And they had forts and firearms, so she developed a multi-pronged strategy of resistance that she would sustain for nearly 4 decades. First, she employed guerrilla warfare. She abandoned her traditional capital and moved her entire court and population eastward, deeper into the interior. This created a mobile kingdom. Her forces, known as the Mbangala, were highly disciplined and could strike quickly and then disappear into the landscape. They would raid Portuguese supply lines, attack their slave gathering parties, and harass their forts. She made the cost of occupying her land incredibly high for the Portuguese. Second, she was a master of diplomacy and alliance building. She knew she was not strong enough alone. She forged an alliance with the Dutch, who were competing with the Portuguese for control of the Atlantic trade. She sent ambassadors to their commanders. She offered the Dutch military support in exchange for guns and training. In 1641, with Nzinga's help, the Dutch successfully captured Luanda from the Portuguese. This was a major strategic victory. It cut off the main Portuguese base of operations and gave her a powerful European ally. Third, she used her kingdom, Matamba, as a safe haven. She declared it a free land for anyone escaping Portuguese slavery. This was a revolutionary idea. Escaped slaves, called Colombos, from all over Angola flocked to her banner. This had 2 benefits. It swelled the ranks of her army with motivated soldiers who had a personal reason to hate the Portuguese. It also crippled the Portuguese economy by depriving them of labor. Her kingdom became a symbol of freedom and resistance. Fourth, she was flexible in her identity and allegiances. To deal with the Europeans, she used their own tools. She had been baptized as a Christian in her youth and took the name Ana de Souza. When it was politically useful to deal with the Portuguese, she would emphasize her Christian faith. When she was leading her Mbangala warriors who had their own distinct traditions, she would participate in their rituals. She even allied with local cannibalistic warrior groups, adopting their customs to solidify their loyalty. To her enemies, this made her seem duplicitous. To her people, it showed she was a pragmatic leader willing to do whatever it took to survive. Her long war had ups and downs. The Dutch were eventually driven out by the Portuguese. Her alliances shifted. But Nzinga never gave up. Even in her 60s and 70s, she was still leading her troops in battle. She would dress as a man and fight at the front. She was a constant thorn in the side of the Portuguese Empire. Finally, in her old age, she negotiated another treaty with the Portuguese in 1657. This time they were negotiating with her as the undisputed ruler of a powerful kingdom. She had fought them to a standstill. The treaty largely recognized her control over Matamba and Ndongo. She had not driven the Portuguese out of Africa, but she had successfully defended her people's independence and created a state that would remain a strong regional power long after her death. Nzinga's brilliance was her endurance and her adaptability. She combined guerrilla warfare, international diplomacy, social engineering, and personal charisma into a long-term strategy of resistance. For over 40 years, she outthought, outfought, and outmaneuvered a European superpower. She understood that in an asymmetrical war, you don't win by crushing the enemy. You win by not losing, by making their victory so costly that they eventually have to deal with you as an equal. Number 11. Can you build an empire with a ghost army? The story of Empress Jingu of Japan is wrapped in myth. The historical records of her reign in the 3rd century AD, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, were written centuries later and mix history with legend. We do not know for sure if she was a real person, but the story of her strategy is so unique that it became a foundational myth of Japan. Whether she was real or not, her legend provides a fascinating look at psychological warfare. Jingu was the wife of Emperor Chuai. According to the legend, the emperor was planning a campaign against the Kumaso, a troublesome tribe within Japan. As he was preparing, a deity spoke through Empress Jingu. The god told the emperor not to attack the Kumaso. There was a much richer land across the sea, a land of treasure that looked like a silkworm's belly. The god promised him this land, Korea, if he would just invade it. Emperor Chuai was skeptical. He climbed a high hill and looked out across the sea. He saw nothing but water. He told the god he was lying and went ahead with his campaign against the Kumaso. He failed. Soon after, he died. The gods were angry he had disobeyed them. This left Jingu in a difficult position. She was a pregnant widow. The court was in disarray, but she believed the divine message. She decided to carry out the invasion of Korea that her husband had rejected. Her first challenge was to confirm her authority. She had to prove to the skeptical court and the army that she was now the rightful leader, acting on divine orders. She performed a ritual to suppress the Kumaso rebels, which was successful. This solidified her control. Her next problem was the invasion itself. It was a massive undertaking. She had no way of knowing how strong the enemy kingdom of Silla in modern Korea was. She needed an advantage. Her strategy was not based on numbers or weapons. It was based on divine intervention and psychological shock. First, she took steps to ensure the success of her mission in the spiritual realm. She performed purification rituals. She had her ministers make new weapons and build new ships. Most importantly, she dealt with her pregnancy. The legend says she tied a stone to her waist to delay the birth of her child until after the campaign was over. This was a powerful symbol of her dedication. She was literally putting the needs of the state ahead of her own body and her child. When the fleet was ready, she stood before her army. She gave a speech that was a masterpiece of propaganda. She told them the gods had promised them victory. If they were brave, they would win great riches, but if they deserted, they would face divine punishment. She created an atmosphere of absolute certainty. This was not a war of conquest. It was a holy mission. The truly brilliant part of her strategy came during the crossing. As her fleet approached the coast of Silla, the king of Silla looked out and saw the Japanese ships covering the sea. But he saw something else too. The chronicles say that the god of the sea, Watitsumi, sent great sea creatures to the surface. Whales and giant fish surrounded the Japanese fleet, appearing to push the ships toward the shore. Another god, the god of the wind, sent a great storm that drove the fleet onto the Sillan coast with unstoppable force. Whether this was a real storm or a mythical embellishment, the effect on the Scylla kingdom was a psychological one. They did not just see an army of men, they saw an army accompanied by the gods of the sea and the wind. They saw a supernatural event, they were terrified. The king of Scylla reportedly said, "I have heard that in the east there is a divine country called Japan. This is no ordinary army. We cannot fight them." The Scylla did not even try to fight. The legend says they were so overcome with fear that they surrendered without a single battle. Their king came down to the shore, bowed before Jingu, and offered his kingdom as tribute. He promised to be her horse keeper and to send tribute to Japan every year. The other two kingdoms of Korea at the time, Baekje and Goguryeo, were said to have followed suit, also submitting to Jingu's authority. Jingu had, conquered a foreign land without losing a single soldier. Her strategy was to create an aura of divine power so overwhelming that the enemy's will to fight simply evaporated. She used ritual, symbolism, and propaganda to build this aura. The ghost army of sea monsters and storms, whether real or a story told later, was the final masterstroke. It transformed a human invasion into a divine judgment. After her victory, she returned to Japan, finally gave birth to her son, the future Emperor Ojin, and ruled as regent for nearly 70 years. Her legendary conquest of Korea became a cornerstone of Japanese national identity for centuries. It was used to justify later invasions and to create a sense of national destiny. The historical truth of Empress Jingu is debatable, but the strategic lesson from her story is clear. The most effective battles are sometimes the ones that are won in the mind of the enemy before the first sword is even drawn. Number 10. How can you win a war by controlling the food? Isabella I of Castile was not a general who rode at the head of a charge. She was a new kind of military strategist. She understood that wars in the late 15th century were changing. They were no longer just about heroic charges and summer campaigns. They were becoming complex logistical operations. Her brilliant military mind was focused on organization, supply, and technology. This was most evident during the Granada War, the 10-year campaign from 1482 to 1492, to conquer the last Muslim emirate in Spain. The Emirate of Granada was a difficult target. It was mountainous. Its cities and fortresses were well defended. The previous centuries had seen many failed Christian campaigns against it. The armies of Castile and Aragon, which Isabella ruled jointly with her husband Ferdinand, were skilled in open battle. But they were not prepared for a long, grinding war of sieges. Isabella recognized this problem from the start. Her strategy was not to seek a single, decisive battle. It was to systematically dismantle the Emirate of Granada piece by piece. She saw the war as a massive project that needed to be managed. Her first and most important innovation was in logistics. In medieval warfare, armies usually lived off the land. They would forage for food and supplies as they went. This was inefficient, and it limited how long an army could stay in the field. It also devastated the countryside. Isabella changed this completely. She created a centralized supply system. She used the power of the crown to buy huge quantities of grain, wine, and other supplies from all over Spain. She organized vast mule trains and wagon convoys to deliver these supplies directly to the army at the front. This meant her army could campaign year-round. They could conduct long sieges without starving. While the defenders of a city were running out of food, Isabella's soldiers were receiving regular meals. This steady supply chain was her most powerful weapon. It ground down the enemy's will to resist. Her second strategic focus was on technology, specifically artillery. Siege warfare had traditionally been a slow process of trying to starve a city out or undermine its walls. Isabella invested heavily in the newest and most powerful cannons from France and Burgundy. These were massive bronze guns that could fire heavy iron or stone cannonballs. And they were difficult to move and operate, but Isabella's logistical skill made it possible. She had special roads built to move the heavy guns through the mountains. She hired skilled gunners from across Europe. When her army arrived at a city like Ronda or Loja, they did not just surround it. They subjected it to a relentless bombardment that its medieval walls could not withstand. The psychological effect of this artillery was enormous. It made resistance seem futile. Her third innovation was in military medicine. She saw the number of soldiers who died from wounds and disease. So she created the first military field hospitals called ambulancias. These were not just tents where the dying were left. They were organized medical facilities with doctors, surgeons, and nurses. They were funded directly by the Queen. This dramatically improved the morale of her soldiers. They knew that if they were wounded, they had a chance of survival. And a healthier army is a more effective army. Fourth, she took personal command of the war effort. While Ferdinand was often at the front with the army, Isabella was the war's chief administrator. She traveled constantly, setting up her court in cities close to the front lines like Cordoba or Seville. From there, she was a one-woman defense ministry. She signed every order for supplies. She organized the recruitment of new troops. She managed the war's finances. She even visited the troops in the field, riding among them in armor, which was a huge boost to their morale. The soldiers saw her as their patron and protector. They called her the king's captain. The culmination of her strategy was the final siege of the city of Granada itself. It was the capital and the heart of the emirate. It was a huge, well-fortified city. A direct assault would have been incredibly costly. So Isabella applied all her methods. She used a complete blockade, cutting off all supplies to the city. Her well-fed army settled in for a long wait. To show they were serious and not going anywhere, she ordered the construction of a permanent military city outside Granada's walls. It was called Santa Fe. It was laid out in a grid pattern like a Roman camp with walls, towers, and gates. It was a clear message to the people inside Granada. We are here to stay. You will get no food. We will not leave until you surrender. The psychological pressure was immense. Inside Granada, there was hunger and political division. Outside, there was a well-supplied, determined army and a permanent city. After 8 months, the emir, Muhammad II, known as Boabdil, surrendered. On January 2nd, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand rode into the city of Granada. The Reconquista was complete. Isabella's military brilliance was not in her tactical genius on a specific day of battle. It was in her understanding that modern warfare was won behind the lines. It was won by the quartermaster, the engineer, and the doctor as much as by the knight. By mastering logistics, technology, and morale, she was able to accomplish what generations of Spanish rulers before her had failed to do. She was a CEO of war. Number 9, what if the best defense is to never stop moving? Amina is a legendary figure in the history of Nigeria. She was the warrior queen of Zazzau, a Hausa city-state in the 16th century. The stories of her life, mostly passed down through oral tradition and later written in the Kano Chronicle, paint a picture of a remarkable military leader. Zazzau was a center of trade, dealing in salt, metals, and slaves. It was a prosperous kingdom, but it was also surrounded by rivals. Amina's father taught her military and political affairs. She was a skilled warrior from a young age. When her brother became king, she was the leading warrior of his cavalry. When she became queen around 1576, she did not adopt a defensive posture. Her kingdom's wealth came from trade. To protect that trade, the routes had to be secure. To make them secure, she had to dominate the surrounding lands. Her grand strategy was one of perpetual military expansion. The core of her strategy was the constant campaign. The legends say that 3 months after taking the throne, she launched her first military campaign. And she never stopped. For her entire 34-year reign, she was at war. She did not fight to permanently annex large territories in the way a European monarch might. Her goal was to make other towns and chiefdoms her vassals. She would conquer a town, force it to pay tribute, and then move on to the next. This created a huge sphere of influence and a buffer zone around her core territory of Zazzau. It also kept the trade routes open and flowing into her capital. Her army was built for this kind of warfare. It was centered on a well-trained and loyal cavalry force. And Amina herself was a formidable cavalry commander. This mobility was key. It allowed her to strike quickly, overwhelm local defenses, and keep her enemies off balance. She was not interested in long sieges. Her method was to raid, conquer, and subordinate. A key military innovation attributed to Amina is the building of fortified walls around her military camps. These earthen walls are known as Amina's Walls Ganuar Amina. After she conquered an area, she would have her army build one of these fortifications. This served several purposes. It provided a secure base for her soldiers in newly conquered territory. It was a symbol of her power and control, and it helped to protect the new trade routes she had established. Many of these walls still exist in northern Nigeria today. This strategy combined mobile offensive warfare with the creation of permanent defensive structures. It allowed her to expand her control and then consolidate her gains. She pushed her kingdom's borders as far as the Niger River in the south and west, and she controlled the trade routes connecting the western Sudan with the coast. She made Zazao the most powerful of all the house estates. She never married and never had children. The legends say she took a new husband in every town she conquered and had him executed the next morning, so he could not tell any tales. This story, whether true or not, adds to her mystique as a ruler completely dedicated to her military and political life, unencumbered by personal attachments. Her strategy of constant warfare had a profound effect on the region. It made Zazao wealthy and powerful. It introduced new military tactics and defensive architecture. But it also came at a high cost. It was a system built on constant conquest and the extraction of tribute, including slaves, from her neighbors. The brilliance of Amina's strategy lay in its relentless, proactive nature. In a dangerous and competitive political landscape, she decided the best way to survive and prosper was to be the most dangerous force in the region. She did not wait for threats to come to her. She went out and eliminated them. She understood that for a trade-based kingdom, control of the roads was everything. Her 34-year continuous campaign was a single, sustained, strategic operation designed to achieve and maintain that control. She did not build a stable, centralized empire. She built a network of tributaries dominated by her mobile army, a system perfectly suited to the political and economic realities of her time and place. Number 8, how do you fight a war when your king is a prisoner of war? Margaret of Anjou was the Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses in the mid-15th century. She was French, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her husband, King Henry VI, and her son, Edward. Her problem was that Henry VI was a weak and ineffective ruler who suffered from bouts of severe mental illness. During these episodes, he was completely unresponsive. This created a power vacuum at the heart of the English government. That vacuum was filled by Richard, Duke of York. York had a strong claim to the throne himself. He and his allies, the powerful Neville family, began to challenge the authority of the king and his queen. This conflict between the House of Lancaster, led by Margaret, and the House of York, led by Richard, was the Wars of the Roses. Margaret was not a traditional queen. She was the de facto leader of the Lancastrian faction. Her primary strategic goal was to preserve the throne for her husband, and more importantly, for her son. Her strategy evolved over time, shaped by defeats and victories. Initially, her strategy was political. She tried to isolate the Duke of York at court. She used her influence over her husband to have York dismissed from his positions and to promote her own allies. This worked for a while, but it only increased the tension. When King Henry had a complete mental breakdown in 1453, York was made protector of the realm. Margaret was completely shut out of power. This is when her strategy shifted from political maneuvering to military preparation. When the king recovered, Margaret convinced him to reverse all of York's decisions. This was the final straw. The two sides gathered their armies. At the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the Yorkists won a decisive victory. They captured King Henry VI. Margaret now faced a new and difficult situation. She was a refugee, forced to flee the battle. Her husband was a prisoner, a political pawn in the hands of her enemy. The Yorkists were running the government in his name. Many queens would have given up. Margaret did not. Her strategy was to build a new power base away from the Yorkist-controlled city of London. She established her court in the Midlands, in places like Coventry. There, she began to rally support. Her strategy was based on personal loyalty and the defense of the legitimate royal succession. She appealed to nobles who were rivals of the Yorkists or who felt a strong duty to the crown. She used the birth of her son, Prince Edward, as a powerful rallying point. She was not just fighting for her weak husband anymore, she was fighting for the future of the dynasty. She also pursued a clever financial strategy. The crown was broke. She used the revenues from her own lands and the Duchy of Lancaster to fund her new army. She also promised land and titles to nobles who would join her cause, a powerful incentive. In 1459, her new army was ready. But her strategy was not just to fight, it was to use the law as a weapon. She convened a parliament at Coventry, a parliament of devils, which was packed with her supporters. This parliament declared the Duke of York and his main allies to be traitors and sentenced them to death. This legally legitimized her war. She was no longer a rebel. She was the queen, acting on behalf of the lawful king against a group of declared traitors. This led to the Battle of Ludford Bridge, where the Lancastrian army, led by Margaret's commanders, confronted the Yorkists. But the battle was won before it even started. Margaret's forces had offered a royal pardon to any of the Yorkist common soldiers who would desert. Faced with the Queen's army and the promise of a pardon, the Yorkist army melted away overnight without a fight. York and his allies fled into exile. It was a brilliant victory, achieved through a combination of military pressure and psychological warfare. As Margaret's fortunes turned again, the Yorkists returned from exile and defeated her army at the Battle of Northampton in 1460. Once again, they captured her husband, King Henry. Margaret was again a fugitive. Richard of York now went to London and officially laid his claim to the throne. Margaret's response was her most audacious. She fled to Scotland. There, she made a deal with the Scottish Queen Regent. She promised the Scots the strategic border town of Berwick upon Tweed in exchange for military aid. This was a controversial move, giving away English territory. But it was a pragmatic decision. She needed an army, and Scotland was the only place to get one. With her new Scottish and Northern English army, she marched south. The Duke of York, now the official heir to the throne, came north to meet her. He underestimated her. He holed up in Sandal Castle for Christmas. Margaret's forces surrounded the castle and lured him out. At the Battle of Wakefield, the Lancastrian army crushed the Yorkists. Richard of York was killed. His head, wearing a paper crown, was stuck on the gates of the city of York. Margaret's strategy had worked. She had been defeated twice. Her husband was a prisoner. But through relentless fundraising, political maneuvering, and shrewd alliances, she had raised a new army and eliminated her primary rival. Her brilliance was her refusal to accept defeat. In a world where politics was dominated by men, she became the heart, mind, and will of the Lancastrian cause. She understood that in a civil war, the fight is never over until one side is completely destroyed. Number 7. How do you lead an army from a gilded cage? Caterina Sforza was an Italian noblewoman of the Renaissance. She was the ruler of the small but strategic cities of Forli and Imola. She was famous for her beauty, her intelligence, and her ruthless nature. Machiavelli wrote about her as an example of a bold ruler. She was not a queen of a large kingdom, but she defended her small state with the ferocity of a lioness, and her most famous military strategy was executed while she was, for all practical purposes, a hostage. In 1488, her husband, Girolamo Riario, the Lord of Forli, was assassinated. The conspirators, members of a rival family, seized the city palace. They captured Caterina and her 6 children. It seemed like their coup was a success. There was just one problem. The city's main fortress, the Rocca di Ravaldino, was still loyal to Caterina. The Castellan, the man in charge of the fortress, refused to surrender. The conspirators needed the fortress to secure their control of the city, so they came up with a plan. They would use Caterina to get the Castellan to surrender. They brought her to the edge of the moat surrounding the fortress. They told her to order the Castellan to open the gates. If she refused, they would kill her children, whom they held with them. This was an impossible choice for a mother. Caterina seemed to agree to their demands. She told the conspirators that the Castellan would not believe an order shouted across a moat. She needed to go into the fortress herself to convince him. To show her good faith, she would leave her children behind with them as hostages. The conspirators, believing she would never abandon her children, agreed. They let her cross the bridge and enter the fortress. As soon as the drawbridge was raised behind her, Caterina's demeanor changed. She went to the top of the fortress walls. The conspirators below shouted for her to surrender the castle. Katerina unleashed a torrent of insults at them. They reminded her that they still had her children and would harm them. What happened next became a legend. According to Machiavelli, Katerina lifted her skirts, exposed her private parts to the conspirators below, and shouted that she had the means to make more children. She was telling them that the future of the dynasty was with her, not with the children they held hostage. Her state was more important than her family. This shocking act was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. It completely stunned the conspirators. They had assumed a mother's love would be her weakness. She turned it into a declaration of strength and ruthless determination. They had no response. Her message was clear. There was nothing they could threaten her with that would make her surrender. Her strategy did not end there. From inside the fortress, she began to organize the defense. She directed the fortress's cannons to fire on the conspirators' positions in the city. More importantly, she had already planned for this kind of situation. She had powerful allies. A messenger was sent to her uncle, Ludovico Sforza, the powerful ruler of Milan. An army from Milan and Bologna was soon on its way to Forli. The conspirators' position began to collapse. The citizens of Forli, initially supportive of the coup, saw that Katerina was not defeated. They saw a powerful army marching to her aid. They quickly turned on the conspirators, the coup fell apart, the assassins were hunted down and killed, or Katerina emerged from the fortress and retook control of her city. She had her revenge on everyone involved. And Katerina's strategy was a high-stakes gamble. She risked her children's lives. In the end, the conspirators did not harm them. But her gamble was based on a deep understanding of power and psychology. She knew that her enemies saw her as a weak woman, and she used that prejudice against them. Her defiant act on the castle walls was not just a crude gesture, it was a calculated strategic communication. It told her enemies, her subjects, and her allies that she was in command and would not be broken. By entering the fortress, she turned her own gilded cage into an impregnable command center from which she saved her state. Number 6. Can a single act of revenge secure a dynasty? Zenobia was the queen of the Palmyrene Empire in the 3rd century AD. Palmyra was a wealthy oasis city on the edge of the Roman Empire in modern Syria. It grew rich by controlling the trade routes between Rome and Persia. Zenobia's husband, Odaenathus, was a loyal client king of Rome. He was a brilliant general who defeated the Persian Sassanids and stabilized Rome's eastern frontier. For his service, Rome gave him the title Corrector of the Whole East. He was the most powerful man in the region. In 267 AD, Odaenathus and his eldest son were assassinated. The motive is unclear, possibly a family dispute or a Roman plot. This left Zenobia as regent for her infant son Vabalyathus. Like Olga of Kyiv, she was a widow in a precarious position. The Roman Empire was in a period of crisis with weak emperors and constant civil wars. The Persians were always a threat. Palmyra's power was based on the personal prestige of her dead husband. Zenobia's first strategic move was to secure her power base. She did not panic. She quickly consolidated control in Palmyra. She had the assassins dealt with. She presented her son as the new ruler, but everyone knew that she was the one in charge. She was known for her intelligence, beauty, and ambition. She was well educated and could speak multiple languages. Her grand strategy began to take shape. She was not content to be a mere client queen of a chaotic Roman Empire. She saw an opportunity. Rome was weak. Persia was quiet for the moment. She decided to carve out her own empire. This was a bold and dangerous plan. Her strategy was a mix of cultural propaganda and military conquest. On the cultural front, she fostered a unique Palmyrene identity. She created a court that was a blend of Greek, Syrian, and Roman culture. She attracted scholars and philosophers. She presented Palmyra not as a subordinate to Rome, but as its equal, a center of civilization. She even claimed descent from Cleopatra and Dido of Carthage, linking herself to other powerful Eastern queens who had challenged Rome. On the military front, she acted swiftly. In 270 AD, she launched a massive invasion of the Roman provinces to her south and west. Her brilliant general Zabdas led the Palmyrene army, First, they conquered Roman Arabia, then they marched into Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. They defeated the Roman governor and captured Alexandria, one of the most important cities in the world. This was a stunning victory. Controlling Egypt gave Zenobia immense wealth and control over Rome's grain supply. At the same time, she sent another army north into Anatolia, modern Turkey, conquering territory as far as Ankara and Kara. In just a few years, Zenobia had created a massive empire. It stretched from Turkey to Egypt. It was a direct challenge to Roman authority. For a while, she maintained the fiction that she was acting on behalf of Rome, securing the East for the emperor. The coins she minted showed her son's face on one side and the face of the Roman Emperor Aurelian on the other. But in 272 AD, she took the final step. She declared her son Augustus Emperor and herself Augusta Empress, and she removed Aurelian's face from the coins. This was an open declaration of independence. She was no longer a regent. She was the ruler of a rival empire. This was a strategic miscalculation. She had underestimated the new Roman Emperor Aurelian. He was a tough, energetic soldier emperor. He had just finished dealing with threats in the west. Now he turned his full attention to Zenobia. Aurelian marched east with a large, veteran Roman army. Zenobia's strategy was to meet him in open battle. Her army relied on heavy cavalry, the famous Palmyrene cataphracts, and horse archers. At the Battle of Imme, near Antioch, the Romans used a clever tactic. They pretended to flee. The Palmyrene heavy cavalry, confident of victory, pursued them. The long chase tired out the heavily armored Palmyrene horses and riders. The Romans then turned and attacked the exhausted cavalry, defeating them. Aurelian repeated this strategy at the Battle of Emesa. Again, the Palmyrene army was defeated. Zenobia's military strategy had been countered. Her army was broken. She retreated to her capital, Palmyra. She prepared for a siege, confident that the city's strong walls and desert location would make it impossible for the Romans to capture. She also hoped for help from the Persians. Aurelian was relentless. He brought his army across the desert. He surrounded the city. He cut off all supplies. Zenobia saw that the situation was hopeless. The Persians did not come to her aid. She decided on one last desperate strategic move. She slipped out of the city on a fast camel and tried to escape to Persia to raise a new army. She was captured by Roman cavalry before she could reach the border. With their queen captured, Palmyra surrendered. Zenobia's empire was destroyed. She was taken back to Rome and paraded in Aurelian's triumph, bound in golden chains. Her fate after that is uncertain. Some say she was executed, others say Aurelian spared her, and she lived out her life in a villa in Italy. Zenobia's military strategy was audacious and, for a time, brilliantly successful. She exploited a moment of Roman weakness to build a powerful empire with lightning speed. Her mistake was in underestimating her opponent and in transitioning from a client queen to a direct rival. Her ambition outran her resources, but for a brief, glorious period, the queen of a small desert city challenged the might of Rome and nearly won. Number 5, how do you protect a throne with a piece of paper? Now, Tamar the Great was the queen of Georgia during its golden age in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. She was not a battlefield commander in the same way as Boudica or Amina, but she was the supreme commander of a nation that became a major military power under her rule. Her strategies were a combination of diplomacy, state building, and military oversight that transformed her kingdom. When she came to the throne in 1184, she was young. The powerful Georgian nobles saw a chance to increase their own power at the expense of the crown, and they forced her to accept their choices for her first husband and for some of her ministers. Her first strategic challenge was not a foreign enemy, but her own aristocracy. Her first husband, the Rus's Prince Yuri Bogolyubsky, was a disastrous choice. He was a drunkard and a poor soldier. After 2 years, Tamar had him divorced and exiled. This was a bold move for a female monarch in the medieval period. The nobles were furious. Yuri later returned with a rebel army, and Tamar had to fight a civil war against her own ex-husband. Her loyal generals defeated the rebels. By winning this internal conflict, Tamar asserted the supremacy of the royal authority. This was the foundation of her reign. She had proven she would not be a puppet of the nobility. With her domestic power secure, Tamar turned to foreign policy. Georgia was a Christian kingdom surrounded by powerful Muslim states, most notably the Seljuk Turks. For centuries, Georgia had been on the defensive. Tamar's grand strategy was to reverse this. She would go on the offensive. Her strategy was built on a series of military campaigns that were not random raids, but carefully planned operations with specific strategic goals. And she did not lead the armies herself. She had a group of brilliant generals like the brothers Zakare and Ivan Makargzeli. But she was the one who approved the plans, raised the armies, and set the objectives. Before every major battle, the chronicles say that Tamar would address the troops, sometimes barefoot, and pray for their victory at a church before they marched off. She was a powerful symbol of divine sanction for their campaigns. The Georgian army under Tamar was one of the most effective in the region. It was a multi-ethnic force, including Georgians, Armenians, Kipchak mercenaries, and others. It was known for its powerful heavy cavalry. The strategy was to use this army to push back the Seljuks and create a pan-Caucasian empire under Georgian protection. Her armies won a series of stunning victories at places like Shamkor in 1195 and Basian in 1202. In these battles, the Georgian army, often outnumbered, used superior tactics and discipline to defeat larger Seljuk forces. The result of these campaigns was that Georgia expanded its influence over a huge area, including much of Armenia and what is now Azerbaijan. But Tamar's most innovative strategic move was not on the battlefield. It was the creation of the Empire of Trebizond in 1204. In that year, the Knights of the Fourth Crusade sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire fell into chaos. Tamar saw a strategic opportunity. She had relatives from the old Byzantine imperial family, the Komnenoi, who had taken refuge at her court. She gave her relatives, Alexios and David Komnenos, an army. She sent them to capture the city of Trebizond and the surrounding lands on the south coast of the Black Sea. They were successful. They established a new state, the Empire of Trebizond, which was a Georgian client state. This was a brilliant strategic move for several reasons. It created a friendly buffer state between Georgia and the hostile Turkish states in central Anatolia. It gave Georgia a new ally with a strong navy, which Georgia itself lacked. It also gave Georgia control over important Black Sea trade routes. And it was a huge boost to Tamar's prestige. With the great Byzantine Empire in ruins, she was now the most powerful Orthodox Christian ruler in the world. She was the protector of the faith. Her titles reflected this. She was called King of Kings and Queen of Queens. Tamar's reign was the peak of Georgia's military and political power. Her strategy was to first consolidate power at home, then use a reformed and powerful army to go on the offensive, and finally to use diplomacy and opportunism to create allied buffer states that would protect her kingdom and enhance its power. She showed that a ruler did not need to be on the battlefield to be a great military strategist. Her brilliant oversight and bold political vision were the true weapons that forged the Georgian Golden Age. Number 4. Must a queen choose between her son and her kingdom? Ya Asantewa was the queen mother of Ejisu, a part of the Ashanti Empire in what is now Ghana. She was not a reigning monarch in the European sense. She was a respected elder and advisor. But in 1900, at the age of 60, she became the commander-in-chief of the Ashanti army in a war against the most powerful empire in the world, the British. The Ashanti Empire had been in conflict with the British for decades. The British wanted to control the region's rich resources, especially gold. By the 1890s, they had conquered much of the surrounding territory. In 1896, they exiled the Ashanti king, the Asantehene Prempeh I, to the Seychelles Islands. This was a deep humiliation for the Ashanti people. The final insult came in March 1900. The British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, traveled to the Ashanti capital, Kumasi. He called a meeting of all the Ashanti chiefs. He was angry they had not paid a tax the British had imposed. And then he made a demand that showed a profound ignorance of Ashanti culture. He demanded they hand over the golden stool. The golden stool was not just a throne. To the Ashanti, it was a sacred object. They believed it contained the sunsum, or the soul, of the entire Ashanti nation. It was the ultimate symbol of their identity, their unity, and their independence. It was never to be sat upon, not even by the Asantehene. For a foreigner to demand to sit on it was the deepest insult imaginable. The Ashanti chiefs were stunned into silence. They left the meeting and held their own secret council. They were afraid. The British had Maxim guns and a modern army. The Asantehene was in exile. They debated what to do. Many of the chiefs argued for surrender. They said there was no hope of winning a war against the British. This is when Ya Asantewa stepped forward. She was ashamed of the men's fear. She gave a speech that has become legendary in Ghanaian history. She said, "Now I have seen that some of you fear to go forward to fight for our king. If it were in the brave days of Osei Tutu, Okomfo Anoki, and Opoku Ware I, chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a single shot. No white man could have dared to speak to the chiefs of Asante in the way the governor spoke to you this morning. Is it true that the bravery of Asante is no more? I cannot believe it. It cannot be. I must say this, if you, the men of Asante, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." Her words shamed the chiefs. They were inspired by her courage. They made her the leader of the rebellion, the commander of the Ashanti forces. The war that followed is known as the War of the Golden Stool, or Ya Asantewa's War. Her strategy was to hit the British where they were strongest and most vulnerable, their fort in Kumasi. She gathered an army of thousands and laid siege to the fort. Inside were the governor, a handful of British officials, and several hundred colonial police. For 3 months, Ya Asantewa's forces besieged the fort. They cut the telegraph wires. They blocked all the roads. They engaged in constant skirmishes with the defenders. Her goal was to starve the British out and capture the governor. It was a bold and direct strategy. The siege was effective. The people inside the fort were running out of food and ammunition. They were suffering from disease. The British had to send a massive relief column of several thousand soldiers with modern weapons to break the siege. When the relief column approached, Ya Asantewa adapted her strategy. She knew she could not defeat the main British force in a pitched battle. So she used guerrilla tactics. Her soldiers set up ambushes in the thick forest. They built stockades to block the roads. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The fighting was fierce. The British took heavy casualties. Ultimately, the superior firepower of the British army was too much. They broke the siege and relieved the fort. Ya Asantewa and other Ashanti leaders escaped into the jungle. For several more months, they continued to fight a guerrilla war. But the British launched a systematic campaign to hunt them down. They burned villages and destroyed crops to deny the rebels food and shelter. In the end, Ya Asantewa was captured. The British, in an act they thought would break the Ashanti spirit, exiled her to the Seychelles, the same place where they had sent the Asantehene. She died there 2 decades later. The British won the war. The Ashanti Empire was officially annexed into the Gold Coast colony. But Ya Asantewa's strategy had a profound long-term impact. She had lost the war, but she had won the fight for the Golden Stool. The British were so shaken by the fierceness of the rebellion that they never again asked for the stool. They realized it was a line they could not cross. The Golden Stool was kept hidden and was not brought out again until years later when the Ashanti had regained a measure of self-governance. Ya Asantewa's brilliance was not in winning the war, which was impossible. It was in her leadership. Her strategy was to reignite the fighting spirit of her people by appealing to their deepest sense of identity and honor. At a moment when the male leadership was ready to give up, she, a 60-year-old woman, chose to fight. She defended the soul of her nation, and in doing so, she ensured its survival. Number 3, when your brothers failed, you take over. The Trung sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Ni, are national heroes in Vietnam. They led the first major rebellion against Chinese rule in the 1st century AD. For over 1,000 years before they were born, Vietnam was a province of the powerful Han dynasty of China. The Chinese governors imposed their laws, their language, and their culture on the Vietnamese people. And Trung Trac was the wife of a local Vietnamese lord. He was a proud man who resisted the increasing control of the Chinese. The Chinese governor, a man named Su Ding, decided to make an example of him. He had Trung Trak's husband arrested and executed. This was a political move designed to intimidate the local nobility. It had the opposite effect. Like Boudica, Trung Trak turned a personal tragedy into a cause for national liberation, while she, along with her younger sister Trung Ni, decided to fight back. The traditional stories say that Trung Trak stood before a crowd, announced her husband's death, and swore an oath to avenge him and free her country. Their strategy was to build a broad coalition. They were from a prominent family, which gave them influence. They traveled through the Vietnamese towns and villages, calling on the local lords and the common people to rise up. Their message was simple: drive out the Chinese and restore Vietnamese independence. They were surprisingly successful. The Vietnamese people were tired of Chinese rule. Many local leaders who had their own grievances pledged their support. The sisters were not just political leaders. They were military commanders. They trained an army, which included many women in its ranks. The legends say the sisters themselves were skilled warriors, often riding into battle on the backs of war elephants. In 40 AD, their rebellion began. Their military strategy was one of speed and momentum. They did not engage in a slow guerrilla campaign. They launched a full-scale offensive to retake the Chinese administrative centers. Their first target was Milin, their home district. They captured it easily. This victory inspired more people to join their cause. Their army grew larger. They then marched on the main Chinese headquarters at Louis Lao. The Chinese governor, Su Ding, panicked. He shaved his head, cut his beard, and fled in disguise. The Chinese administration in Vietnam collapsed. The Trung sisters and their army captured more than 65 cities and citadels. In a matter of months, they had liberated the entire country. It was a stunning success. For the first time in over a century, Vietnam was free. The people hailed the sisters as their saviors. They proclaimed Trung Trak as their queen. For 3 years, the Trung sisters ruled an independent Vietnamese kingdom. They abolished the hated Chinese taxes and tried to restore the traditional Vietnamese laws and customs. Their strategy had worked perfectly in the short term, but they now faced a much larger strategic problem. The Han Dynasty was a superpower. The emperor in China was not going to let a valuable southern province go without a fight. He sent one of his best generals, Ma Yuan, with a massive army to crush the rebellion. Ma Yuan was a cautious and experienced commander. His strategy was to advance slowly and methodically. He used his superior numbers and resources to overwhelm the Vietnamese defenses. The Trung sisters' army was brave, but it was a militia, not a professional force. They were no match for the veteran Han legions. The sisters fought back bravely. They met Ma Yuan's army in open battle, but they were pushed back again and again. Their forces were worn down. The legends say their final stand was at a place called Hatman. Defeated and facing capture, the two sisters chose to take their own lives rather than be taken prisoner. The rebellion was over. The Chinese re-established their rule over Vietnam. So was the Trung sisters' strategy a failure. They only ruled for 3 years. But their legacy was immense. Their rebellion was the first major uprising for Vietnamese independence. It created a powerful story of national identity and resistance. The sisters became immortal heroes, symbols of Vietnamese courage, and the refusal to be dominated by a foreign power. Temples were built to honor them, and they are still celebrated in Vietnam today. Their military strategy was brilliant in its initial phase. They successfully united a fractured people and used a lightning offensive to achieve a quick and total victory against the local Chinese forces. Their ultimate failure was not a failure of strategy, but a matter of overwhelming odds. They were a small new kingdom facing a massive established empire. They could win the battle for Vietnam, but they could not win the war against China. Yet, their brief moment of freedom inspired 1,000 years of resistance that would eventually lead to Vietnam's lasting independence. Number 2, could a teenage girl outsmart a king? Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi, was one of the most famous leaders of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. She was not a queen of a great empire. Jhansi was a small princely state in northern India. Her story is one of a leader who was pushed into a war she did not want and became one of its most formidable commanders. Lakshmi Bai was the wife of the Maharaja of Jhansi. They had a son, but he died as an infant. On his deathbed, the Maharaja adopted a young boy as his heir. This was a common practice in India, but the British East India Company, which controlled much of India, had a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse. This doctrine stated that if a ruler died without a natural heir, his state would be annexed by the British. The British Governor-General Lord Dalhousie refused to recognize the adopted heir. He declared that Jhansi would be annexed. Lakshmi Bai, who was in her early 20s, was offered a pension and told to leave the palace. She refused. She famously declared, "I shall not surrender my Jhansi." Her initial strategy was not military. It was legal and political. She hired a British lawyer to argue her case in London. She sent petitions to the British authorities. She tried to use their own system against them. This failed. The British were determined to take her state. When the Great Rebellion broke out across northern India in 1857, Jhansi was initially quiet. The British garrison there, fearing a mutiny by their own Indian soldier sepoys, asked Lakshmi Bai for help. She agreed. This shows that even at this stage, she was not looking for a fight with the British, but when the local sepoys did mutiny and killed the British officers, they proclaimed her their ruler. She was now in a difficult position. She was the leader of a rebel state, whether she wanted to be or not. Her strategy became one of defense. She began to fortify her city and her great fortress. She organized an army, which included both men and women. She set up foundries to cast cannons. She turned Jhansi into a bastion of the rebellion. For several months, she ruled Jhansi as an independent state. In March 1858, a large British army under the command of Sir Hugh Rose arrived to recapture Jhansi. Rose was a skilled commander. He surrounded the city and began a heavy bombardment. Lakshmi Bai was in personal command of the defense. She was everywhere, inspecting the fortifications, directing the repairs, and encouraging her soldiers. She was a tireless and inspiring leader. The defense of Jhansi was ferocious. Even the women of the city were seen on the walls, fighting alongside the men. Rose's army was taking heavy casualties. At a critical moment, another large rebel army, led by a commander named Tope, arrived to attack the British from the rear. This was Lakshmi Bai's chance. If the two rebel armies could coordinate, they could crush the British between them. This was the strategic hope. But the British were better disciplined. Rose detached a small part of his force, which met and defeated Tope's much larger army. The relief army was broken. Jhansi was now alone again. The British redoubled their assault and finally breached the city walls. The fighting moved into the streets. It was brutal, house-to-house combat. Lakshmi Bai saw that the city was lost. Her strategy now shifted to survival. She had to escape to continue the fight. In the middle of the night, with her young adopted son tied to her back, she and a small group of guards mounted their horses. In a legendary feat of bravery, she galloped to the city wall, spurred her horse, and leaped over the rampart to safety, escaping the city as it fell. She rode for a day and a night to join the rebel leader Tope. Now, she was no longer a defending queen. She was a guerrilla commander. She argued that the rebels needed a secure base. She convinced the other rebel leaders to march on the great fortress city of Gwalior. The strategy for taking Gwalior was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The Maharaja of Gwalior was loyal to the British, but his army was not. When Lakshmi Bai and the other rebels approached the city, the Maharaja's army deserted him and joined the rebellion. The Maharaja fled. The rebels had captured one of the most important fortresses in India without a fight. This was a huge victory. It gave them a base, a treasury, and a new army. The British were stunned. Sir Hugh Rose had to march his exhausted army to Gwalior to retake it. The final battle was fought in the hills outside the city. Lakshmi Bai, dressed as a cavalryman, led a charge against the British forces. She fought fiercely. But during the battle, she was wounded by a sword and then shot by a British soldier. Her followers carried her from the field and she died. Lakshmi Bai lost her state and her life. But her strategic leadership was brilliant. She transformed from a petitioner to a fortress defender to a guerrilla commander. Her plan to seize Gwalior was a strategic masterstroke that briefly revived the rebellion. Sir Hugh Rose, the man who defeated her, later described her as the bravest and best of all the rebel leaders. She became an icon of the Indian independence movement, a symbol of a queen who chose to fight for her people's freedom rather than accept a quiet life on a British pension. Number 1. What happens when war becomes a math problem? Mavia was the queen of the Tanukids, a confederation of semi-nomadic Arab tribes in the late 4th century AD. They lived in the Syrian desert on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. They were foederati, or allies of Rome. Their job was to help defend the border against the Persians and other threats. In exchange, they received subsidies from the Roman government. Around the year 378 AD, Mavia's husband died. The Roman Emperor Valens decided to interfere in the Tanukid succession. This was a political mistake. Mavia, a warrior queen, took command of her people. She launched a massive rebellion against the Roman Empire. Her rebellion was not just a series of random raids. It was a brilliantly executed strategic campaign that brought the entire Roman East to a standstill. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about her war. He said she ranged over the far-flung provinces of the east, from the borders of Egypt to Phoenicia, and laid waste the lands on the frontiers of Palestine. Mavia's military strategy was perfectly suited to her people and her environment. She did not have a large, heavy infantry army that could meet a Roman legion in a pitched battle. She had light cavalry, fast-moving warriors on horses and camels who knew the desert intimately. Her strategy was a classic example of asymmetrical warfare. First, she used lightning raids. Her forces would emerge from the desert, strike Roman towns and military outposts, and then disappear back into the desert before the slow-moving Roman legions could respond. They targeted supply lines and trade routes, crippling the Roman economy in the region. This was a war of 1,000 cuts. Second, she expanded the conflict to multiple fronts simultaneously. She did not just attack one area. Her forces were active across a vast territory from modern-day Syria down to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. This stretched the Roman defenses thin. The Roman commanders did not know where she would strike next. They could not concentrate their forces against her. Third, she combined her guerrilla tactics with conventional battles when the time was right. She did not just raid and run. When she had the advantage, she would stand and fight. The Roman accounts describe a major battle where she personally led her troops and defeated a Roman army sent against her. She proved that her forces were not just a nuisance, they were a serious military threat. Her campaign was so successful that it created a major crisis for Emperor Valens. At the time, he was preparing for a massive war against the Goths on the Danube frontier in the Balkans. This was his top priority. Mavia's rebellion in the east was a huge distraction. He could not afford to have a major war on two fronts. He needed to transfer troops from the east to fight the Goths, but he could not do that as long as Mavia was rampaging through his eastern provinces. Mavia understood this strategic dilemma. Her rebellion was not just about winning battles, it was about applying maximum political pressure. She had calculated correctly. Valens needed peace in the east more than she did. He was forced to negotiate. Mavia's terms for peace were not about money or land. They were about religion. She was a Christian, but she followed a particular ascetic monk named Moses. Her one demand for peace was that the Romans consecrate Moses as a bishop for her people. Valens, an Arian Christian, was reluctant to consecrate an Orthodox Nicene Christian like Moses. But he had no choice. His strategic situation was desperate. He needed his eastern legions for the war against the Goths. He agreed to Mavia's demand. Moses was made a bishop, and the war ended. This was a total victory for Mavia. She had fought the Roman Empire to a standstill. She had achieved her political and religious goals. She had asserted the independence and power of her people. The peace treaty re-established the Tanukids as allies of Rome, but this time on her terms. She even sent some of her cavalry to help the Romans in their war against the Goths. Ironically, the troops Valens was able to move from the east were not enough. A short time later, he was defeated and killed by the Goths at the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Mavia's strategic brilliance was her complete understanding of her own strengths and her enemy's weaknesses. She used the desert as her fortress and mobility as her weapon. She understood the larger strategic context of the Roman Empire and knew exactly when and where to apply pressure to achieve her objectives. She turned a local conflict into an imperial crisis and solved it with a single, non-negotiable demand. For Mavia, war was not just a matter of fighting, it was a cold, hard calculation of leverage and timing. And she got her math exactly right.